to get started, this is not a technical talk at all. This is going to be very much how Sabre Labs uses Finagle. That's what the point of this is. Started from the bottom, now we're here. If you're wondering why I've named this after a Drake track, it's simply because we brought in Finagle, I think, in a very different way than most people do. We started at the very bottom at a very small team level, and it has grown organically. It was not a top-down decision. So going on to that, my name is Jeff Davis. I work for Sabre. That is a company in Dallas. If you don't know who Sabre is, that's okay. Well, they would say it's not okay, but sometimes depending on who I'm talking to, they don't like that. But they started actually a long time ago in the early 60s. They came out of American Airlines. We've been selling software into the travel industry for years and years. And so the primary use case for them, what they sell into, are GDSs for mid-market and big market hotels, airlines, car rental systems, anything. If you traveled from out of the city to here, whether you booked a flight or you were on a hotel, chances are really good that your reservation lives somewhere in our system. And so having said all that, I don't actually work for the GDS group, I work for the Labs group. And what Sabre Labs is very much focused on is how technology impacts travel in the next 2 to 5 years. So we do a lot of work with wearables. We do a lot of work with 3D printing. That's kind of more on our realm. Ex Machina is a little beyond where we're spending a lot of our time on. That's a little too far out for us right now. And so in reality, what that means though is we do a lot of prototyping. The longest in the 2 years I've been there, the longest that we've actually worked on a project is about 2.5 months. It's routine for us to have projects that last about 1 to 2 weeks. It is also at least once or twice a quarter, we'll have a project that lasts 1 to 2 days. And so given that kind of very compressed time frame, the initial thought is why do you need to go to Finagle? It's a large tool built for massive amounts of requests, et cetera. And that's a totally fair question, because for us in the prototyping world, the reality is 1 request per second is not uncommon when you're building an MVP. The reality is the business logic matters more than the high-end throughput. Well, this is a very unconventional use case for Finagle in a lot of ways, but when we start with these very small prototypes, we want to get the business logic right, and being able to leverage Finagle has allowed us to move at a much more quickly. So to give a little bit of a background here, in the days of yore in 2012 when I first got started, a lot of times third-party integrations were very small. We wanted to do things like log in with Twitter, or we wanted to be able to export your trip to a calendar application or something like that. We wrote a lot of Rails, a lot of Rails. But of course, even in the last 2 to 3 years, the concept of an MVP has moved forward. And so now we have to integrate a large number of third-party services, even to do very basic minimum viable products. And so one of the things that immediately became apparent to us, real MVPs take performance into account. When you're clicking on a submit or a calculate or a purchase button, a user might be willing to wait 1 second to 1.5 seconds for a response, but they're not going to wait 25 seconds for all of your HTTP requests to conceivably go through, assuming that the timeout gods didn't chuck your request into the lake at some point. And so the most important thing I want to point out to all of this is that if you want to get started in Finagle, a Finagle service does not have to be exported onto a network to be valuable. For all of the additional hoopla that I've read about Finagle, and it's got a lot of amazing things about it, and I don't want to downplay that at all, Finagle is fundamentally a tool to reason. And a lot of times the reasoning involves a massive amount of throughput and a massive amount of requests, but you are still reasoning at a very basic level. And so if you are wanting to get started in Finagle, I would encourage you, don't wait till you think you have 100,000 requests per second and 1 million requests per second to get started. You can use Finagle and you can use the Finagle tools right out of the gate, even within your own very small applications. And the reason that I want to point this out, this is a quote by Edward Dijkstra when he was at University of Texas in about 2000, I think. It is not only the violin that shapes the violinist, we are all shaped by the tools we train ourselves to use, and in this respect, programming languages have a devious influence. They shape our thinking habits. And I'm going to add to that a small addendum, also frameworks and libraries. So if you're writing a lot of Rails code, every problem looks like a Rails problem. If you're writing a lot of Finagle code though, you're able to leverage that specific ecosystem to be able to reason at a lot more simple level. And that's been very valuable for us. We want to spend our time writing business logic. We don't want to spend our time solving the same domain issues over and over again. I'm not going to break any news here. I think everyone here has copied and pasted code before. When we first started working on this, we did a lot of copy pasting. We'd have a Rails project that lived somewhere on GitHub. We needed to solve a similar problem. We do what everybody does. They either go to Stack Overflow, they go to a previous code example, they copy it out, they paste it in, they change the variable names. If they're really into it, they delete the code comments. And then, they compile and it goes. That's an aggressive day, but sometimes you're feeling good. You want to put that extra step in your framework. And we realized that we were burning a lot of time doing this, and just a lot of time. We had very particular services we were rebuilding constantly, and even if they were very low numbers of requests per second, again, we were still rebuilding those things. We wanted to be able to leverage stuff we had written to stand up and work and be able to hit it much more quickly. And so we started out by initially creating Finagle Services that live in an application server. And that seems kind of blunt, but every service that we create, whether it's an airport service or a hotel service or anything like that we might use in the domain, that service always lives, and whatever business logic we have always lives in the specific app server for the project that we're working on. And again, these projects live anywhere from a day to usually 2 to 3 weeks. But that happens all the way up until it gets used twice. So I'll give a canonical example of an airport. We're a travel company. We deal with airports constantly in some way, form, or fashion. And so we got tired of writing the same airport service. And so that eventually, the phrase I'll use is we exported it onto the network. We went from keeping that service inside the same application code base. And instead, that service now lives out in the ether, on Aurora, actually, how we run it. And we connect to that through Scrooge. And so this is like a more complex version of what we might actually work. And I'm going to point out at the bottom, the middle part right here, the app server spitting JSON, we use Finch for our application servers. That's where we want to be spending as much time as possible. We want to be spending time writing the business logic to figure out and to solve your specific problem for whatever business unit that is. And we've also got into the habit of we want to be able to spit very similar requests out to whether we're writing in React or whether we're writing on iOS or Android. We want to be spitting out JSON so that our front-end developers, we have a very clean break and it's easier to do testing. It's very easy to mock a JSON payload. Everyone's done that. And so up, as you can see, the next level, we'll have an airport service and a ground service and location-based services and all the kind of things that you hit for services. But one of the things that we do a lot is we hit third-party APIs very, very heavily. So we've actually written Finagle wrappers around every single one of these APIs. The Twitter API, we have a Finagle thing that hits it, parses the JSON, we'll serve that back out. Same thing with a lot of the Sabre APIs, Uber. Evernote actually has a Thrift API. So props to them. They have that. That was a little difficult to get working the first time, but they do have that. Same thing with Tripcase and Google's absolute smorgasbord of locations apps that kind of all seem like they do the same thing, but they're valuable. And so we hit all of those externally, but we don't want to have to think about it. And when I say that we don't have to think about it, we want to be able to respond again specifically to that middle component. Where is this business logic line? We want to solve a problem. And I'm going to give a very concrete example. This actually happened last week. We had a request that came in to build a trip estimator app. And we had people inside the company that, you want to travel to, let's say, FinagleCon, and you don't live in San Francisco, so you have to go to your manager and you say, how much is this trip? I want to go. And the guy says, how much, or man or woman says, how much is this going to cost? So you have to go and you actually have to go pile up and give a specific estimate that might include taxes and per diems and ground transportations and hotels and airports and everything else. And so we want to go solve that. But we actually, we want to be able to go solve that. And so we actually wrote that application. The main guts of that application took us about 5 hours to write because we were able to leverage every single one of the services required to be able to do that already existed that we had written previously. We were able to leverage a previous the microservices architecture to move both very fast, but very correctly as well. And so this, in that particular instance, I know this is going to be low to a lot of people here, but if you're just getting started, that particular endpoint to do the trip estimation would have been anywhere between 23 to about 28 HTTP calls, depending on your authorizations. You can imagine how long that could take in Rails. This with Finagle and using Finch, we did it in under about a second. Usually it comes in about 1.2 seconds. And that makes running all the way across. So specifically, what Finagle protocols do we use? We use HTTPX. If you were still on HTTP, I would highly motivate you to go to HTTPX. I would consider it much more user-friendly to work with. We also have Finagle Postgres. We have one that we wrote that's internal that we're going to, at some point, try to merge into a lot of, there's a separate Finagle Postgres that's on the Finagle GitHub group that is not the same as the one that we have worked with before. When we get some time, hopefully, that may not be till the end of the year, but we're going to try to do a little bit of the merging. We also use, I can't believe I misspelled it, but we also use Finagle Redis, especially with clustering. That's an additional protocol that we have on top of that. And then we also use Scrooge to connect. That's not Finagle, and I know the core services library teams made that point very clear, but you know, in some ways, I think of Scrooge and Finagle maybe not as the same, but the uses of them are very, very tied together in my head when I think about reasoning in these things. And so the next thing, there's a nice Richard Nixon quote here, but if you were wondering about how to get started in this, if you don't have an initial use case, this is a great Richard Nixon quote. People don't vote for things, they vote against them. And so if you want to know how to get started with a Finagle-based system, my advice to you is to find a project that doesn't work in what you're currently using at. And that's how we got onto Finagle. We had a system that we could make, I think it was eight parallel calls that could all be made at once. Obviously, we can't do that in Rails. So instead of just futzing about with it, we said, okay, we're not even going to mess with this. What's the potential solution? And we went, and that's how we made our way into Finagle. I cannot highly recommend finding something that people don't want to do as a motivational tool to move or to change tools, because people get very, in my experience, people can get very you get comfortable with the tool. I get comfortable with the tool. You don't necessarily want to take that additional leap. And then onboarding Finagle, the group I work with some amazing developers. I work with 2 great Rails developers and 2 front-end devs. No one on the team had worked on the JVM in years prior to that. So not only going to the JVM, but going specifically to Finagle itself was a big jump. And so a couple of things that I would point out for this: avoiding overly magical syntax. I admit I enjoy the siren's call of the Haskell side of Scala and all the combinatorial syntax and a lot of that stuff. But for someone that's just coming on, a lot of that stuff can get very confusing very fast. And you want to focus first and foremost. You can only move as fast as your slowest developer when you're doing a lot of this stuff. It's just a parallel organization. So avoid that so that they can at least reason with what they're doing. The second thing I want to also remember is this has been my personal experience, but in Scala, every Scala developer I've known that's come to it has either come to it from a functional side or they've come to it from an object-oriented side. And so they understand kind of like half the language, but maybe not the other half of the language. And so it's always important to explain necessarily when something has been solved or you think a problem has been solved. Don't just assume that because the syntax has solve the problem that the reasoning behind it is not there. That's just something to be very careful with. But I will say this, in the span of a little less than a few months, we have actually earlier this week or last week, I had a Rails dev that wanted to write something in Finch, and I said we probably should actually not write it in Finch. Sorry, Jason. Sorry, I'm nervous, I forgot his name. But we actually do that. They enjoy it that much. So in only a few months, we've got people that are long-time Rails devs that have moved on. And so that being said, that's kind of it. That is it. Any questions?
You actually have a working microphone this time, so we don't have to
Okay.
share. Questions?
You mentioned that having a lot of services available for your other external services helped you a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that there's a specific benefit of using Finagle, but wouldn't that be also available if you write a library and have it lying around for whichever?
You can. One of the things that was actually a very, okay, so let me back up. The question was what is the benefit of using Finagle in this specific instance as opposed to just having like a gem, a Ruby gem laying around or some other code that you could bring on? And the answer to that is interdependency. We actually had that talk a lot when we first started working on this. If your services are very, very orthogonal, then I can understand why then that doesn't necessarily come along for the ride. But in our case, we had a lot of interdependencies. And so when you have, as soon as that interdependency ratio starts to move back and forth, you have something where you want to stand up, between the services, excuse me, you don't want to have to like go chasing off which services you want. We want to have a service that's up, and we use it internally, but we also, those services that we stand up might be used by other teams as well, and we don't want them to have to wait around and go through all of that issues. We want to be able to post to a service discovery area and let them just use that. So that's why availability, and we don't want to have to futz with dependencies.
Has Finagle made it to production yet?
Yes. Yes.
One last question. Any other questions?
I will actually, I'm going to add a quick addendum to the other question earlier about why use Finagle. We've actually always also found when we are transferring over, when we transfer over some of these MVPs to business units that may take them on, it's been valuable to us to be able to say exactly what the expected, when they're testing and building out a new endpoint, if they want to take it over, they have an exact understanding of what that service is going to return. And so that's, again, that's something that they can build off of. Documentation, in the case of Finagle, the endpoint, the service itself is kind of the documentation. And so they're able to leverage that to be able to move that, to be able to move on that. So,
Thank you, Jeff.
thanks.